What we're talking about is local food supply, regional food supply, and national food security. Ag is every one of us. And so to put it in an us versus them context is, I think, the worst thing we can allow people to do in a discussion about water use.
Welcome back to the On Land Podcast. The big news in the West these days is drought, and specifically drought in the Colorado River Basin. Going forward, we're looking to bring you some really interesting conversations with land stewards who are trying really cool things to deal with the drought, save water, and restore watersheds. So today, we wanted to provide listeners with some of the big picture context and some background to better understand water in the West. To do that, we turned to Andy Mueller. Andy Mueller is the general manager of the Colorado River District. The Colorado River District is a public body that serves as the principal water policy and planning agency for the Colorado River Basin within the state of Colorado. They provide legal, technical, and political representation regarding Colorado River issues for the communities of 15 counties in northwest Colorado, which includes the headwaters of the mighty river itself. Andy is a veteran water attorney and a graduate of the University of Colorado Law School's esteemed program in water law. Before becoming the general manager at CRD, he spent 22 years in private practice representing ag water users on the western slope, learning about the issues directly from landowners and producers. Andy recently spoke with Leslie Allison, the executive director at Western Landowners Alliance. Leslie spent 16 years managing a private ranch in the headwaters of the Rio Grande before helping to found Western Landowners Alliance in 2012. So she's no stranger to these issues. So let's get to it. Here's Andy Mueller and Leslie Allison.
Andy, welcome to the show. Terrific. Well, you are in the thick of things, I have to say. And so we have a whole bunch of questions for you today to hopefully help landowners and any listeners out there get a better understanding of what these challenging issues are right now behind the shortages that we're hearing about in the Colorado River Basin. And so I think the first thing I'd like to ask you to do, Andy, is just, can you paint listeners a picture of the Colorado River Basin and the Colorado River Compact? So what are the upper and lower basins we hear about? And how is water allocated among the basin states and stakeholders?
Sure. Leslie, the Colorado River Basin physically includes parts of Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and New Mexico. That's in the upper basin. And if you think about it, that tends to be the area in which most of the water is actually produced, where the snowpack falls and the water runs off the mountains. And then parts of Nevada, Arizona, and California are also inside the physical basin of the Colorado River, as well as a portion of the country of Mexico. And so the interesting thing about the basin, just to think about it, is that it does not include the cities of Albuquerque, Denver, Colorado Springs, Cheyenne, Wyoming, Salt Lake City, Los Angeles, San Diego, but it does include Phoenix and Tucson. But all those cities that are not included within it that I just listed, and many others, receive water from the Colorado River through transbasin diversions. And so those cities often consider themselves to be within the basin, but physically they are not. And I think that's an important distinction. You asked me about the compact. The compact was an agreement that was created, in fact, the first interstate compact dealing with any river in the United States was negotiated in the early 1920s and signed in 1922 by 6 of the states. Arizona came along in 1929. They had been part of the negotiation, but they signed it 7 years later than the other states did. The impetus for those negotiations was a recognition back then by the upper basin states, and actually a gentleman in Colorado in particular by the name of Delph Carpenter, who was watching the river and the population locations and agriculture in the basin be developed. And he realized that what governs water law in almost every one of those states in some fashion, well, in every one of those states in a different modified fashion in some, is the law of prior appropriation. So first in time, first in right. And the upper basin folks were concerned that the rapid development of Southern California was going to create a situation where at some point the Supreme Court would weigh in and say that's the doctrine of prior appropriation applies on an interstate basis on the river, and California would have all of the senior water rights. And in fact, maybe the entire claim or most of the claim to the river. And so the states came together, the upper basin states said, we really want what's considered an equitable apportionment. So a fair split of this river. We know we haven't developed our share yet. We know that you guys have developed quite a bit, but maybe not your entire share down in the lower basin. So how do we divide that up? And what they came up with was an interesting mathematical equation. They came up with hard numbers. And instead of adapting to the great variability that the Colorado River has always shown, if you look at the flows, you can see a cycle where it goes through some wet years and then very dry periods and then back into wet years. And you can see that in recorded history since just before 1900 on stream gauges. But in today, we can go back and see it over the last 2 centuries through tree ring data and some other data. This river has always been extremely variable. The compact authors probably should have split it by percentage, but instead they said in hard numbers, the lower basin gets 7.5 million acre feet. The upper basin gets 7.5 million acre feet. And then there's a provision that allows the lower basin to get another 1.5 million acre feet. And the express compact language doesn't say where they're getting that. The compact notes and the books that were written at the time, the speeches that were given, all indicate that that was water not out of the main stem of the Colorado, but out of the tributaries in the lower basin. So the Gila, the Salt, the Virgin, those rivers were where they were going to get their extra million. And then it said, oh, by the way, the country of Mexico will also get some share of this, but we don't have a treaty with Mexico yet. So whatever that happens through our treaty, that's what they'll get. That was 1922. In 1944, there was a treaty made with Mexico. Mexico receives under that treaty 1.5 million acre feet of water. So if you add all of that up, we've got 17.5 million acre feet of water allocated between the upper basin, the lower basin, and the country of Mexico. Hopefully that helps set the stage.
Great, thank you, Andy. And I would be interested to hear about what the upper basin did with that compact. And then as a next question, we'll talk a little bit about what the implications are of all of this.
Well, and that's the interesting thing is, so the upper basin said, all right, well, let's get together and figure this out. What do we have to divide up? And in 1948, they got together and they signed a compact, negotiated it in the year and a half prior to that. And even by 1948, the framers of many of the same people were involved in the upper basin that had signed the 1922 compact. And they said, you know what? This river is really variable. We are idiots if we divide it up, again, by hard number. So we have this 7.5 million acre feet, but we don't know for sure if it's there. And in fact, there's language in the compact that would say that the upper basin it's been interpreted various ways. It says that the upper basin shall not deplete the river below 75 million acre feet over 10 years. So that's that 7.5 million over 10 years on a running 10-year average in terms of its deliveries at Lee Ferry. That's a point today right below Glen Canyon Dam. So there's this obligation to keep, well, I would say to not deplete the river. Now, lawyers have argued about what that means and continue to argue about what that means. Some in the lower basin say the upper basin has a delivery obligation. Some in the upper basin say, no, we can't take more water out of a stream than we already were taking at that time if it's going to deplete the river below that 75 million over 10. So our pre-existing uses are locked in. But the upper basin said, all right, well, we're not sure we have 75 million over 10. So we're going to divide it up by percentage. And what the state said is we're going to base it roughly on population potential and irrigable land potential in those 4 upper basin states. So Colorado had the biggest share of the irrigable lands and potential population. It received 51.75% of the allotment of water. Utah received 23.5%. Wyoming's at about 14%, and New Mexico's at 11.5%. So they divided that up between the 4 states. There's also a carve out, believe it or not. Arizona has a small part of Arizona that's in the upper basin, and they get a hard number off the top. They get 50,000 acre feet. And if anybody's ever been down to Page, Arizona, and seen the Navajo generating station, that was actually part of Arizona's 50,000 acre foot consumption. The power plant's now offline, but that To put it in context, that plant was being run on Colorado River water from the upper basin share, not the lower basin share. So it's a weird one there. But so that's how they divided it up. And over time, just to put it in context, the upper basin has never used more than about 4.5 million acre feet. And really, on average, it's somewhere around 4 to 4.2 million acre feet in total consumptive use. Whereas in the lower basin, we've seen consumptive use climb as high as 11 or 12 million acre feet in certain years. They're running today at an average of about 10 million acre feet. So above their compact allotment, and it's really fairly significant. Mexico has historically been able to use 1.5 million acre feet. They've engaged in a lot of negotiations recently with the states to reduce their use as this drought has really taken hold, and they've been pretty good partners on the river, but they do have that 1.5 million acre feet delivery obligation. The country of the United States has that obligation to the country of Mexico.
So wow, that's a lot to digest for starters, right? We have the whole river divided up between the two basins on a hard number basis. We have the treaty with Mexico. We have then this percentage allocation among the upper basin states. And then we have this very sort of unequal utilization of these different apportionments, across. So that's creating a problem right now. And then we have this increasing water shortage, right? So I think people are generally aware that there is a water shortage, and most people probably paid attention to the headlines that Lake Powell and Lake Mead are at historically low levels. But I'm not sure everybody really understands what that means. What are the implications of that? What is the extent of the crisis, and what's at stake in the coming years here?
Well, I think in order to understand the implications, we've got to look at what's driving that crisis. So what's causing the reservoirs to drop? And it's really two things, honestly. It's both a reduction in the supply and an over demand on the water. So we have two things, and just addressing the reduction in supply, the science today is pretty clear. The upper Colorado River Basin, and maybe I'll try to drive it home just as a little short story. My district, the Colorado River District, covers 15 counties in western Colorado. And in our district, in that area, about 29,000 square miles of land, about 65% of the entire flow of the Colorado River originates in our mountains. It's like the breadbasket of the Colorado River, right? It's one of the primary sources. And in that same area, if you look at data from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Agency, we can track since 1895 a sharp increase in the average daily temperatures, where many of our counties in our area have average temperatures that have risen over 4.5 degrees Fahrenheit since 1895. And in the last 20 years, it's accelerated. It isn't a straight curve. It's unfortunately ramping up today. And the science is pretty clear that somewhere between 3 and 9% of the flow of the Colorado River decreases by 3 to 9% for every 1 degree increase in temperature Fahrenheit. We really are seeing a precipitous decline in that flow of the river. On average, we can look back 20 years ago, we've lost about 20% of the flow of the river. It is just not there, right? And the fascinating thing is, our snowpack hasn't declined by 20%. Our precipitation in the mountains hasn't declined by 20%. And so it can't be explained by lack of rain. It's really what the scientists refer to as a hot drought that's causing this, right? So it's the temperature. We were all taught back in elementary school about the water cycle, where it snows or rains and then it flows in the river, and then we grow plants, and then it evaporates off the plants and off the lakes, and then the clouds come and they drop the rain, and it's this big cycle. Well, what's happening in our experience recently is that it's getting so windy and so hot in our spring and early summers that the snowpack is no longer melting and the solid's not turning to the liquid state. It's undergoing sublimation or evaporation. It is turning from solid to gas and getting blown away. It never even makes it into the soil. And then, because we've had these hot falls, the moisture gets sucked right out of the soil. So we enter winter with a moisture deficit. So we're getting hit on both ends of the summer, both with less water in our rivers. And then what snowpack falls the next year goes into the soil to fill that soil moisture profile. And by way of example, when we were coming into the water year 2021, in the fall of 2020, there was, on average in the Colorado River Basin, a 12-inch deficit in soil moisture in our soil profile in the mountains, which meant that the first 12 inches of water was going into the local soil profile and not making it to the river. So we've got this decrease in flow. Going back to the compact, we've got a compact where we agreed we had 17.5 million acre feet of water, and we divided it up between all those entities. Well, the 100-year running average production for the Colorado River is at 15.5 million acre feet, but we divided 17.5 million. So we've already got a deficit between what we said everybody could have and what we actually produce. But then if you look at the last 20 years, the river has run an average of 12.6 million acre feet. We're roughly 5 million acre feet less than what the framers thought we were. And now we're at 12.6 million acre feet. And this is the crazy thing. In the last 5 years, where we've really had some hot, dry, windy summers in our mountains. So any of the landowners who have the beautiful ranches in our mountains have seen this wind and this temperature increase. We have seen the decrease in the flow of the river go as low as 11.5 average over the last 5 years. And so we're seeing this decline in the supply of the water. And at the same time, because it's been so hot, primarily down in the lower basin, we've seen an increase in the demand to cover the extra water that needs to be applied to crops and to city lawns and parks. And we've seen an increase in the population growth, right? Phoenix is one of the fastest growing cities in America. Salt Lake City is one of the fastest growing cities. Los Angeles, I mean, just adding millions of people to the basin is increasing the demand. So you've got this increase in demand, decrease in supply. It's been a rough 22 years when you look back at that.
Andy, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the reservoirs themselves, particularly Lake Powell and Lake Mead, and describe sort of how they fit in this whole picture and what their situation is right now.
Sure. And I think the key is that those reservoirs were designed to handle the variability of the river. So even as I mentioned in describing the Upper Basin Compact, by 1948, we were very aware of the fact that the river was extremely variable. And so originally, in 1928, the Boulder Canyon Project Act authorized the building of Lake Mead and the Hoover Dam. And it was initially justified as a flood control measure because if you look back in history, the lower Colorado had these immense floods every 10 years or so. And it's a giant flood that in the early 19th or 20th century established the Salton Sea. The river changed course and went and filled and created the Salton Sea that had not been there before, right? And the Army Corps of Engineers and the Bureau of Reclamation redirected the Colorado River after several years and got it back into its normal channel. So the Boulder Canyon Project Act 1928 created Lake Mead, which today is still the largest reservoir on the river. It is really important because the way it operates and the purpose is it regulates the flow of water and provides great certainty for everybody below the dam. So all of the lower basin landowners and irrigators, cities, they're able to call upon the Bureau of Reclamation that runs that operation. And there are, 16 or 17 different contractors in the lower basin that have massive contracts with the Bureau of Reclamation. I'll point to one that is the most senior, and that's the Imperial Irrigation District down in Lower California. They have the most senior rights on the river in the lower basin. They are entitled to take about 3.1 million acre feet of water. That's a tremendous amount of water, and they irrigate hundreds of thousands of acres with it down there. Literally today, because of the Bureau of Reclamation's work on the Hoover Dam, the managers of IID can schedule orders for water delivery. They call up the Bureau and they say, hey, we need 10,000 acre feet delivered on this day at the All-American Canal. And the Bureau lets the water out. It goes down the river and they get 10,000 acre feet of water at their head gate that goes out and irrigates their fields. It's been remarkably consistent since the reservoir was first filled. And the contractors in the lower basin are used to that certainty. In the upper basin, at the headwaters of the Grand Canyon, or just above it, that's where Lake Powell was constructed, the Glen Canyon Dam. That was authorized in 1956. And in 1956, it was called the Colorado River Storage Project Act. It authorized several things. One was the building of Lake Powell. And then there are three other major reservoirs that authorized at the same time. Flaming Gorge Reservoir, Blue Mesa, or the Aspinall Unit, as it's called in Colorado, and Lake Navajo, which is in New Mexico. Those four together are referred to as CRISP reservoirs, Colorado River Storage Project reservoirs. Their entire primary purpose was to bank water, hold water in their reservoirs during wet years, so that when we hit those dry cycles, the upper basin could continue to release water down to the lower basin and remain in compliance with its compact obligations. And I would say those reservoirs did a fantastic job in most hydrologic circumstances. In fact, in 1999, those reservoirs were about 98% full, right? So we had in total storage about 55 million acre feet of water sitting in storage in the Colorado River between those reservoirs. We saw a very quick hot drought occur between 2000 and 2004, and those reservoirs, especially Lake Powell, dropped precipitously. And it's partially because we didn't start reducing use in the lower basin, so there was just this pull on water coming down. And the interesting thing is, just to compare water users in the upper basin and lower basin, our farmers and ranchers in New Mexico or in Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, they, generally speaking, do not have large federally owned operated infrastructure above them. They don't have big, huge reservoirs like Lake Mead and Lake Powell. Some of them have some access to reservoirs, but not tremendous access. And so in dry years, our farmers and ranchers use less water because it's either physically not available or it's legally not available under our own state's administration of water rights. So, in our state, we're used to our state engineer administering the prior appropriation doctrine and saying, well, there's not enough water in the stream for all the water rights. So junior water rights, we're going to cut you off. And they'll start, if you look at the upper Uncompahgre Basin, that's in southwest Colorado, it's a tributary to the Gunnison River. There's a call that goes on that river from a large ditch that irrigates in the Uncompahgre Project, a very important agricultural operation in western Colorado. Federal project, but that call comes up the Uncompahgre River and it turns off all water rights that were put to use anytime after 1889. So the upper Uncompahgre literally has a situation where they may have, believe it or not, 2,000 decreed water rights. And when that call comes on, only 75 of those 2,000 remain in priority. And so those ranchers, farmers, they get turned off. And they don't have the certainty that exists down in the lower basin because they don't have a reservoir to feed their needs. Hydrologic variability is something most of our farmers and ranchers live with in the upper basin, not something that historically has been lived within in the lower basin. So the federal reservoirs did a great job. This is the thing, though. No one anticipated this longest period of drought that we've had since, as far as we can tell, since the year 1205. And so the reservoirs have drained. And today, the total capacity in that reservoir system that I described sits at about 26% full. So a quarter of what it should, really. And that 26%, if water use isn't reduced quickly and systematically, could mean that we literally will hit a point where those reservoirs are not physically able to deliver water out of them. So it gets pretty scary.
So just to paint that picture out a little bit, that means that people farming below those reservoirs, all that breadbasket of food production is shut off from irrigation. And that has an entire cascade of consequences. There's also the power generation component, and there's recreation, there's all those other things. But really, you're talking about shutting off water all the way down. It's clear that, we have this very deep water crisis unfolding in the West, and that we're going to, for the foreseeable future, have to live with less, which means all stakeholders, are going to have to figure out how they're going to do it. We all are going to have to be part of that in the West, and it could change the future of the West in some very profound ways. We're not just talking about individual farms, we're talking about entire breadbaskets of agriculture and economies and things that are at stake up and down the basin. So we're beginning to hear a lot about, okay, how are we going to distribute this? And what people talk about is often the fight between farmers and cities, agriculture versus cities. And often there's this figure cited that agriculture uses 80% of the water. And you're hearing more and more calls to reduce the agricultural water allocations. But that water is what actually grows food that people put on their plates, right? Ranchers and farmers aren't personally drinking that water. And it's going into the food that's on our plates. We don't have the food on our plates unless we're getting it from someplace else far away. And that has its own whole string of issues with it. So what happens if we reduce our ability to grow food in places like Colorado, Arizona, Utah, and California? And are there ways that farmers can keep supplying food with less water?
Leslie, you hit on something that I think is really worth focusing on for a minute. I work and have worked all of my professional career with agricultural producers. And the press today, mainstream press, really seems to vilify Western agriculture as this water hog. Agriculture is not, in my mind, is not a special interest group. Agriculture is every one of us. All right. I live in a small urban city in Western Colorado. I live downtown. I have a little garden. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is that I eat food every day. I drink beverages every day. I am agriculture because I need agriculture to survive my daily life. I don't produce my own crops. I don't make my own food for my family other than occasional hunting and things. But, that's not how we subsist. And ag is every one of us. And so to put it in an us versus them context is, I think, the worst thing we can allow people to do in a discussion about water use. What we're talking about is local food supply, regional food supply, and national food security. I mean, you can hear a little bias in my presentation, my discussion about the lower basin and their overuse and all of that. I will also admit that I eat green leafy vegetables year round. And it comes out of Yuma, Arizona, and the Imperial Irrigation District. And I really appreciate that. And that is irrigated with Colorado River water. We would not be able to have the diets that we do today in America without irrigated ag in the winter in those areas with Colorado River water. Okay. I can't be clearer about the importance of that. I just think it's really critical. And I think when you talk about, yes, 80% of the water in the Colorado River Basin is consumed in the growing of food products. That is true. It is for the benefit of all of us and most of the nation. And in fact, we export those food products around the world. So let's remember that's really important. I think that there is a ag versus urban battle, and there always has been in the Colorado River Basin. We see in our state, again, and I apologize for continuing to refer to it, but we literally have a doctrine in water law that says no one's allowed to speculate in water. So if you can show that you have a use for your water right now, or a new water right, you can show that you have the use now or within the very foreseeable future, you can file and get a conditional right. So you can get right in time in that prior appropriation doctrine. Well, Supreme Court of our state made up this doctrine that said, well, cities are really important. They refer to them as the great and growing cities. And they said, instead of having only 6-year horizon to plan and develop their water right, like the rest of the water users in agriculture, they get 50 years of planning. And anybody else, if they said, well, I'm going to use that water 50 years from now, our court system would say, no, that's speculation. You're speculating. You don't know that you're going to need it. Well, our cities can say, oh, I'm a great and growing city, so I know in 50 years I'm going to triple my population, and therefore I need more water. It's a bias, I believe, that's built into our legal system that favors those urban areas. Now, urban areas are very important to all of us. The economy, the business that is transacted there fuels all of our economic health. But it is it is important to identify and understand, I think, the bias that exists there legally. And I think other states have very similar doctrines, by the way, in terms of how they favor the urban areas. The cities in our state take, I think, in total about 500,000 acre feet a year out of the Colorado River Basin and move it eastward. And when they take that out of our basin, it's gone, right? So it doesn't come back. Whereas our ag users in Western Colorado, when they irrigate their field, that water percolates and runs back to the stream that it came out of, or to another local stream, depending on where their ditches are. And it then rejoins the Colorado River and flows downstream. Most of our crops consume somewhere between 60 and 25% of the water that is actually applied to them. The rest of it goes back into the stream. A lot of folks don't understand that, right? They see a huge amount being diverted and they say, my gosh, they're killing the stream. But in our upper streams throughout the mountains in Western United States, where we have agriculture that is flood irrigated, we have created the return flows over the last 150 years that actually have created an environment in those streams that allow for trout fisheries and habitat that our recreation industry, our tourism industry, and just our citizens think of as and value as some of the most important habitats around, that are created by those return flows that allow for late season flows in our high mountain streams. That's all courtesy at no charge of our landowners in the mountains who are irrigating their pastures and returning that water to the river. It's really hard because most new residents in the mountains look at that flood irrigation and they see waste. They see, well, why should I conserve water if the farmer down the street's not, or if the rancher down the street's not? What they don't understand are the incredible benefits that brings to the ecosystem and recharge to the river.
We understand today the benefits of beavers in many systems, right? They're slowing down the water. That water spreads out. It grows plants. It creates shade. It creates biodiversity. The water's held there, and then it slow releases over time down through the system, right? So the whole thing functions as a kind of a living sponge. And of course, not all flood irrigation is, entirely beneficial in that way, but a lot of it is. It has a similar kind of effect of watering the landscape and creating that living sponge effect and that slow release of water into the system. And while it's there, it's supporting all of the birds, the wildlife, all the different things that depend on that. And so if you were to pipe all the water out of a watershed, for example, down below, you could effectively desertify that watershed. And when you desertify the watershed, then you actually have less capacity to create the positive watershed effects that provide that sustainable, secure water supply for everybody down the system.
Yeah, I would totally agree with you. And I would just say, you mentioned it, but there are places where soil profile may have too much salt or selenium. And so flood irrigation is probably not appropriate because that runoff can really hurt the river. And we've spent a lot of time with our ag producers in those regions doing some piping projects and some on-farm improvement projects. But it has to be a very sophisticated understanding of the soil profile, the water quality issues that related to the runoff. And even in those soil areas where we see those high salt, selenium, there's a way to continue irrigated ag that doesn't hurt stream quality, that also continues to produce local food.
That's a really nice segue into the next thing I want to ask about a little is, what are farmers, ranchers trying to do that can help them continue to irrigate and to provide all the benefits that we've talked about, and to do so with less water, right? Because we somehow going to have to spread water further now. So are you seeing anything that's particularly exciting or encouraging? Or are you guys in the Colorado River District working on any projects collectively or with individuals to explore those options?
That's a great question. We have a number of different projects that we're working with our partners on. One that jumps to mind first is up in the Upper Colorado watershed near Kremling, Colorado. We have a group of our ranchers who are flood irrigators historically. They are oftentimes referred to as ground zero for trans-mountain diversions, right? So Denver water and northern water, which feeds the entire northeastern part of Colorado, where Fort Collins and Greeley and Boulder County and all of those areas that are very heavily populated, they take a lot of water out right in Greene County. So these farmers and irrigators are constantly dealing with stream conditions that are not natural, that are reduced by that pumping. They have been working with some of our ag extension folks from Colorado State University and some of the scientists that the university has on staff to really design a program where they're trying to understand the effects of deficit irrigation on their high mountain grass pastures and even full season fallowing. What really happens to the grass and the ability for the microbiome and the soil profile to stay healthy? What happens to the seeds? And one of our ranchers up there, a guy named Paul Bruchet, is kind of leading the charge. And what he's been experimenting with and been really successful is during the fallowing periods, he's actually reseeded his pastures with a new and different seed mix than what was prevalent. He's got a different mix that they've developed that is incredibly drought tolerant and with less water is producing just as much forage at a higher protein content for his cattle. And it's pretty exciting to see that. And once he's established that, if he deficit irrigates or partial season irrigates, he is still able to get a healthy crop, and the next year it pops right back. So one of the concerns we have about fallowing of ag land, especially in our high mountains, well, really anywhere, is what it does to the soil's ability to produce a crop in the following years or to produce plant life. And we've really seen some really great experiments like this one where we have hope that we can actually do some crop switching just in terms of the type of grass that we're growing so that we can actually help adapt to this lower water future that we have. You know, another one that we've done is in the lower Gunnison River. We've worked with a number of our water users there. And I just want to say the water users there are a mixture of row crop, orchards, vineyards, and some grass pastures. So really quite a variety of agriculture going on. The Mancos Shale, which is the predominant soil type, really has high salt and selenium. So we came in with the assistance of the federal government and the state of Colorado and put together a project where we were able to use money from the Farm Bill and from the Bureau of Reclamation. So we were able to come in and pipe a lot of major delivery ditches. We were able to redo their diversion structures and their head gates to allow the river to flow. We were able to pipe those ditches to the farms and then help with on-farm improvements in terms of sprinklers and water moisture sensors so that we could get the root zones but not get the deep percolation of water. By doing all of this aimed at an environmental benefit, the water quality, we've actually improved the ability of producers to stay in business, right? Because there's less labor to maintain the ditches. There's more automation in terms of their headgate operations and their field irrigations, where they're able to really maximize their efficiency in their crop and their production. The direct diversion of water has decreased. So streams like the North Fork of the Gunnison and the Uncompahgre River, where we've been working, both consistently have more water in them during the hot, dry months of the year. And it's really been benefit to the environment and to our ag community. And I think we can replicate that throughout the West.
You know, looking at this from a systemic sort of standpoint, working together in community scale solutions or West-wide solutions is obviously clearly going to be a piece of that. So there's two systems that we hear about. One are these water sharing agreements where farmers and ranchers in a given area will figure out a way to divide a less resource than they had before so that they can all continue to stay in business to some degree. And then there's this other term that you hear a lot and that's very controversial is demand management. And that's generating quite a bit of controversy. Can you talk a little bit about what demand management is relative to some of these water sharing agreements? And why is demand management controversial? How should landowners be understanding this issue?
One of the things I would say is both water sharing and demand management are things that our agricultural growers have been doing for centuries, or at least a century in the West. You know, Leslie, when I came into Western Colorado as a young attorney, I had all the laws in my mind and I knew prior appropriation. And I got out on a ranch with my ranching clients and they said, I need to shift this ditch water over to a different ditch. And I need your help getting a decree to do that. And I pull up the records and I see that they hadn't been diverting all of their water in the ditch. And I said, well, what have you been doing? And he said, well, Well, in those dry years, I wasn't going to take it all. Fred needed the water down the stream, so I would take it on some days and he would take it. And I said, you had the senior right. What are you doing? That's my lawyer mentality. And he said, yeah, but my kids go to school with him and I need his help when I'm, cutting my crops or moving my cattle, and I need him around. So I'm going to help. So my whole mind shifted, and I had to then, in a change of water use case where the state wanted to cut his water, I had to explain that no, the water was still beneficially used, and the laws just don't actually allow for that. So there's water sharing that I think our ag folks have always used. And then demand management is just the intentional reduction of consumptive use, right? If you think about it, in a drought or a rancher who's on a direct flow ditch, meaning there's no reservoir to feed your ditch, and you look up in the mountains and you see the snowpack is not what it should be, well, you're going to look at your fields and you're going to say, well, the back 40 over there that doesn't produce very much crops, I'm not even going to run water over it, not even once. I know I'm going to have less water, so I'm going to manage my demands by only irrigating my most productive ground. Farmers and ranchers have done that since the invention of irrigated ag, right? I mean, we're talking about civilizations way before ours that handled water the same way. So what is the program that demand management is that's so controversial? And that's an interesting one. It's in the upper basin, those 4 upper basin states. And the concept is, can we find a way to pay, we being society through our governments, pay farmers and ranchers, and in our opinion, cities and suburban areas and industries, so every water user sector, but the discussion is most focused on ag water. Can we pay farmers and ranchers to fallow their fields and thereby produce this water, not consume water, and take that water and send it down into Lake Powell? The reason in the upper basin we would want to do that is there's an agreement between the 4 states in the upper basin and the federal government that says, hey, we're going to try to develop a program that manages our demands and produces extra water for Lake Powell. But if we do that, the upper basin states said, we're only going to do that if we get to control the water. So it doesn't leave Lake Powell unless the 4 upper basin states say it leaves Lake Powell. So it's different than system water, which the federal government controls. And they've controlled it so well that Lake Powell sits at about 22% full. So there's a storage account that was designated for all of the upper basin states. One account, one pool to be used to benefit everybody in the upper basin, the communities. So the question is, what happens if you pay a farmer or a rancher to not irrigate? Does the water actually get to Lake Powell? It's a really good question. If you pay a local family who has been farming and ranching forever to not irrigate, what happens to the funds? The funds that they get paid probably will stay in the community. Our studies show about 60 to 90% of that money will get recirculated in the local community and help keep that community intact. On the other hand, if you set up a water market like this and you start paying people to not irrigate, you'll get something that we've gotten in our state, where we have a number of out-of-state investment funds that have identified the potential of a water market, and they've come into some of our most productive ag land and started buying up thousands of acres of irrigated land. They intend to make money off the non-use of their water. They don't mean to apply the water to a beneficial purpose like growing a crop or using it in an urban area. And our economists, when we looked at that, economists said, look, you pay those investment funds, 100% of that goes out of your community, which means the community declines. And I think, we've seen these fallowing programs in the lower basin already because of some of the growing populations down there. The community, and I think Blythe is probably the best example, the communities have collapsed. They are a shell of what they used to be. And so when you look at this demand management, the question is, how do you prevent widespread harm to rural Western America if you're going to reduce water use and pay people to reduce it? Water rights are clearly a private property right. They should remain that way. Our landowners own them. If they're going to choose to not use a property right, them being paid for it seems fair. But if it's federal money and state money that's being used, to set up the market? How do we design a market in such a way that it keeps that agriculture around in the long term for the benefit of the owners, but also for the benefit of the communities that are built up around them? We've got to look at all of that. We don't have the answers to that. Because of all of these concerns, the concept of demand management became very controversial in our state and the other upper basin states. All water user sectors need to look at how we bring our water use down. But we've just got to protect those farmers and set it up so that it can be an individual landowner's decision as to whether or not they want to enter that market or take an opportunity to. And then how do we also at the same time hopefully design policies that are designed to keep productive ag in place, not only during this dry period, but in the future? And how do we do it and design it with the right sideboards that allow people to monetize their water right if they want to for a period of time and hopefully reinvest that in their property and in their family? But how do we provide that tool without doing permanent harm to the ag industry? And so there are all these questions that we don't have perfect answers to yet.
Right. And one of the biggest challenges right now is that we also don't have time, right? We're really out of water. We're running out of water. And it's accelerating. As you said, as the temperature climbs, we're seeing this accelerate. So we're out of time. But I think there's this fear that the municipalities or the federal government or some combination is going to have to step in and take action if we can't get the stakeholders to some kind of clear agreement very quickly. How worried should landowners be, and how can they be engaged in this process?
The Bureau of Reclamation, the Commissioner of Reclamation said, look, the mass balance in this system, the demands and the versus supply is way out of whack. And I totally agree with her. Their modeling says somewhere between 2 million acre feet and 4 million acre feet a year in demands need to be reduced in the system in order for the system to continue to function. And that's per year, right? Just keep in mind, the upper basin during 2021, a really dry year, only used 3.5 million acre feet of water. You're talking about reducing the demands by as much as the entire 4 states in the upper basin used in 2021. It's an incredible ask or demand that's out there. So yes, every water user who's paying attention should be and is nervous. I know this phrase gets used a lot, but it is always better to be at the table than on the table. And so, yes, our agricultural water users have to come to the table, and not just to be defensive and protect and fight and try to hold on to everything we have, but we've got to come up with solutions and offers that work for agriculture that are created by people who understand our landowners and understand our agricultural producers. Because what will happen if we don't, as an ag community, come to the table with those solutions? Folks who live in urban areas who clearly don't understand the values and the benefits of irrigated ag, they will come with their own ideas and solutions, and none of them will be beneficial or even aimed at making sure that agriculture makes it through this really rough period. And so we've got to come to the table. I think there are groups out there, Family Farm Alliance, the Landowners Alliance. These are really important groups to be at the table. Now, where is that table today? Well, the compact, remember, was signed by 7 states and the federal government. And the table today consists of 7 states and the federal government. And they're meeting behind closed doors on almost a weekly basis. And that's why some of these really critical issues haven't been resolved yet, because the urban areas are saying, yeah, we'll just dry up more ag. And the ag area is saying, not a chance. Why don't you empty your swimming pools and dry up your yards? And then we can talk. And so the question of is, right now, if it's voluntary, and keep in mind, every state still has these priorities of water use. And in most states, agricultural users hold the senior priorities. So you can't just flip the priority system and say, no, cities get the water and ag users, I'm sorry, you lose. It's got to be done in a way that compensates the senior water users. And from my perspective, in a way that is designed or best designed to try to assure the continued success of our vibrant agricultural and landowner community. One of the things I would recommend to our ag users, and I'd We've had a lot of discussions with our users here, but I welcome other people's thoughts on this and landowners' thoughts, is can we design a program that pays people to not irrigate their most marginal lands, right? Even if they would have a full water supply in a year and they'd be able to spread it out over that marginal land and get a crop, can we actually aim the system at those marginal lands and produce some extra water for the system to help balance it? The landowner is made whole by payment. The system has extra water in it. And what's, from my perspective, important in this is that the productive agricultural lands, the ones that actually make the money and pay the bills, stay in irrigated ag, right? Because the demand management program we've been talking about earlier, at least in our state and the other 3 upper basin states, was aimed at ag indiscriminately. They didn't care which ag they dried up. They just wanted a dry up ag. And that, to me, is one of the worst things we could do if we care about our future of our food supply and about the future of our rural communities.
Well, thank you, Andy. That is invaluable. All of that information and insight into this thing. And, you're sitting in the heart of one of the most challenging, complex issues that will ever face the American West. Always has, but it's become much more intense today. I'll close with one last question for you. What keeps you going? What gives you hope that we can come out on the other side of this in a positive way for the West? I'm hoping you're going to say there is something that does.
No, I'm actually tremendously optimistic. And I think your listeners and maybe even you will think I'm really daft when I say this, but I actually believe in the ingenuity of the human race. I think that we can figure this out. We need stakeholders at the table who are trying to help find solutions, but we can adapt to this, right? And Leslie, this is just maybe help frame it, why I'm optimistic. Think back about 4 or 5 generations ago when families, European settlers moved out here and started irrigating the land. Those people moved from a climate, for the most part, either back east or in the Midwest or in Europe, where they didn't have to irrigate. They moved out here and they adapted to a new climate. And they did so because they were innovative and they were creative, and they came up with ways that were unimaginable previously to bring water to the soil and grow crops. And they created a community that we all now live in out here in the American Southwest. I believe that the people who have followed them are just as innovative. And instead of moving to a new climate, that new climate's moved to us. So we can figure this out. We can adapt to it. We can survive. It's just that we have to do it in a way that recognizes the importance of our local regional food supply, recognizes the importance of the value of these communities and the water that depend on them. And so I think we can do it, but it's going to take people like you and me and all of your landowners to engage on this issue.
That's a wonderful closing note. I'm right with you on that. And I just want to say we so greatly appreciate your time and your leadership, and also that of the Colorado River District, which is playing a critical role in this incredibly complex and challenging moment in the West and in U.S. history, frankly. So thank you again for being on the show with us today.
Big thanks again to Andy Mueller for joining us today. I don't know about you, but I learned a ton from Andy about the origins of Colorado River law and the challenges that the system faces today, and what farmers and ranchers in Colorado are doing to address these challenges proactively. You can find links to the Colorado River District website and other bits and bobs that Andy referred to in the show notes, which you can find by heading over to onland.link/podcast. On Land is a production of Western Landowners Alliance, a nonprofit that advances policies and practices that sustain working lands, connected landscapes, and native species. Today's episode was hosted by Leslie Allison and produced by Louis Wirtz and myself, Zach Altman, and edited by Kathleen Shannon. Like this episode? Share it with a friend, leave a review wherever you get your podcasts, and be sure to subscribe to On Land Magazine at the link in our show notes. Your support helps us amplify the voices of stewardship in the American West. Thanks for being here. We'll see you next time.